Hi, welcome to Mike's Attic. This is a new series on my channel where I'm going to be taking one film at a time, one cult sci-fi and horror movie at a time, and looking at them in depth. A bit like those old horror hosts, used to do. So today I'm going to start with Quatermass II. Now it might seem a bit weird starting this new series with a sequel, but whenever I go up to my mum, she's got all these channels and I channel surf, and on Talking Pictures I watched this movie and it's the first time I'd seen it in years, and it really got to me and I really enjoyed it and I really wanted to talk about it. So Quatermass 2, for those people who don't know, Quatermass was a television series that went out on the BBC in the 1950s. And I remember my parents telling me about this when I was a kid. They used to say that people used to run home from work or run home from the pub to see it. It was a real event. It was the first major science fiction TV series in Britain, but it was also one of the first major popular series. It was a huge hit. It started off with Mars from Holst's The Planet Suite, dum 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 dum. This is Quatermass from the BBC, and it was very filmed theatre. It was very creaky, like little sets with loads of hulky great cameras, from different angles. Very cheap, but it captured people's imagination, and it completely kick-started the career of Nigel Kneale, who would go on to become the most influential science fiction writer, certainly in television and film, in the late 20th century. They were adapted into films almost immediately. So the first film was the Quatermass Experiment, directed by Val Guest, as is Quatermass 2. And arguably, I think Quatermass Experiment is the best of the films, even though it has the least interesting storyline. It's got a very simple storyline about an astronaut being taken over by this kind of space virus and he's turning into a monster. Beautiful performance by the actor whose name I forget. But unfortunately, because in those days British films liked to get in an American star to sell them better on the American market, they got in an American guy to play Quatermass, and they picked Brian Donlevy, a real square-jawed, boring, monotone actor, and that's the one sort of bum note in the Quatermass Experiment. Unfortunately, Brian Donlevy will also be in Quatermass 2. But and then quite a few years later, after Quatermass 2, they made Quatermass and the Pit, which is the most popular of the Quatermass films. Most people regard it as the best. Hammer made it, directed by Roy Ward Baker, in colour with Andrew Keir, much better as Quatermass. And then much later in the 70s, ITV revived Quatermass with John Mills. What is interesting about this is, so Quatermass Experiment started it. There was then a kind of aborted second film, which is very little known. It's called X the Unknown. And there was some disagreement between Nigel Kneale and the producers. So officially the scientist in it wasn't called Quatermass, and it didn't become a Quatermass film. But if you watch it, it absolutely is a Quatermass film in all but name. And they get another American actor to play Quatermass. He's called Dean Jagger, and he's very good. He's like your sort of cantankerous uncle inventing stuff in a shed. And he's really good as Quatermass, much better than Brian Donlevy. And the film was directed by Leslie Norman, Barry Norman's dad. So if you can track it down, it's a bit of a curio. It's about radioactive sentient mud. Really, it is. But anyway, so that was the second film. Then comes Quatermass 2, which we'll discuss in a moment. And then comes Quatermass 3. Now, Quatermass and the Pit. Quatermass and the Pit is certainly the most significant Quatermass film, because basically it became the template for almost every sci-fi fantasy series afterwards. The mixture of, the idea of people from aliens from way back interfering in our history and interfering in our evolution and development. It's been in every single British sci-fi series ever since, and it all comes from Quatermass and the Pit. So Quatermass Experiment, X the Unknown, Quatermass and the Pit, these are huge landmarks in British telefantasy. Quatermass 2 has kind of got lost in the mix. And it's probably the least of the films. But I would say, in terms of its story, it's the most interesting. And what I realised when I watched it again this weekend at my mum's house is, or it was a few weeks ago, this was the one that my parents used to talk about. Not Quatermass Experiment, not Quatermass the Bit. This was the one that really scared them and got to them. And in this video, I want to kind of talk about why. Now, the movie starts, and it has a hilarious start, which I love, right? So it's set in this kind of space research base. And Quatermass comes back from talking to some ministers in the cabinet, and he's in a really bad mood. He's had a really bad day at the office and he's barking at his friends. That's what I like about this movie. It starts with the hero, Quatermass, just being kind of crappy to his work colleagues, just shouting at them because he's had a bad day at the office. Only a British sci-fi movie would start like that, and I love it. Anyway, his mates eventually calm him down and say, look, Quatermass, something really interesting is happening here. There's a meteor shower, and the meteors appear to be, they're travelling on a course, not just randomly. Classic start to a British sci-fi movie. So what rather wonderfully, Quatermass just says, okay, come on, let's go, gets in his car, and off they go to where these meteorites are falling. This abandoned village, which just happens to look like a disused airfield. Anyway, so they go through this village, and then Quatermass says, God, look at that over there. And you look over this rise, and there's this huge industrial complex. And Quatermass, fantastic piece of dialogue, says, when was that built? I didn't know anything about that. Hilarious, but also kind of brilliant. But that image, that fantastic image of this, this industrial complex that seems to have been built in about 2 days flat. What I love about it is, in that one image, Nigel Neal captures something. He captures the zeitgeist of the 1950s average British person. The fear of technology, industry, petrochemicals, gas, gasometers, huge tanks. What's in those tanks? What's in those gasometers? What are all these chemical plants? What are they producing? This terror of the growth of industry, of the growth of industrialisation in the English countryside. And also something else, because of course this plant is run very efficiently, like Nazism. Everyone's very sort of cold and authoritarian, and there's rules, and there's no warmth, And so it captures a whole zeitgeist impression of the 1950s of what's happening in this cosy little England world of ours. What is all this newfangled technology? What is this new way of being, this new way of living, this new industry? And what I thought was kind of interesting watching it now, in our era of globalisation, is in a funny kind of way the film it's dated, right? But it's actually become relevant in a new way that it hadn't expected. Because in a way, isn't globalisation the same? Like, what is this globalisation? All this, capitalist, commercial, corporatist world. Take a tube down to Canary Wharf in London. You get out at Canary Wharf, all these steel, glass skyscrapers, all these fancy restaurants from every cuisine in the world, and there's no culture, no tradition, no heritage, a blank world full of moneyed people in suits that all look the same. In Canary Wharf you could be in Shanghai, Dallas, Paris, it doesn't matter. It's a non-culture world, this newfangled world, and it's suddenly appearing and blossoming and ballooning all around us. And in a way, Quatermass peering over and saying, what's that there? I didn't know about that. It's kind of like how a lot of people on the right wing and the left wing feel about globalisation, isn't it? Where's this come from, this globalised world? Starbucks, Microsoft, all these companies that have such power. How did they get there? When did it happen? How did our world change? Where did all our old-fashioned world go? It kind of taps into that in a very interesting way. Anyway. So, Quatermass falls foul of these new fascist industrialists. And then he gets away and he goes to the local town. This is great, right? And so this town is like a sort of Milton Keynes or Wellingborough Gardens or whatever it's called. It's a new town full of endless, boring, featureless suburbs, right? And he goes to the local community centre and they're having a dance in the community centre. And the locals are like, who are you? We don't like strangers round here. That type. And what they are ordinary people who are being recruited by these fascist stroke aliens to work in the plant. And they don't want any trouble. We've got good jobs, we've got good houses, we don't want any trouble. Again, the way that Neil got on hold of something, that post-war English period, the new towns and all these new suburbs being built, and the reliance on corporate capitalism, which of course has a strange resonance now. So they won't help him, you see. And then what he does is, rather wonderfully, he goes to Parliament, right, and he tries to find a politician who will listen to him. We've got to investigate this new petro-industrial complex, right? And he finds this MP, who's a sort of plummy-voiced MP. He said, good God, yes, we've got to go and discover it. We've got to go and investigate it. And so they go on an official visit of this petrochemical plant, so-called. Actually, it's supposed to be producing synthetic food, that's right. And the MP, he does a fast one, and he gets away. And he goes to look what's in these giant towers. And wonderfully, he falls in. And this leads to one of the great images of British 1950s science fiction, one of the most powerful images. And my dad, I remember telling me about this when I was a kid. It even imprinted itself on his memory, and he wasn't a fan of science fiction or fantasy at all. And what happens is the guy falls in, and then he comes back, he climbs back and comes back down the side of the sort of gasometer tower, steaming. He's all black and he's steaming. And Quatermass comes up to him and says, don't touch me, it burns. Fantastic line. It's worth the entry price alone of the film. It's a wonderful, wonderful scene, really strange and weird and frightening. Easily the best moment in the film. Then through a bit of silly plot mechanics, right, the people in the local town rise up, like they're in a Frankenstein movie all of a sudden, you know, bearing pitchforks and saying, down with them, down with them. And Quatermass gets involved in this kind of revolution against the plant. And he and the rebels just happen to get put in the processing room where they control the flow to these gas tanks, these huge gas tanks, so they can stop the flow. And just by sheer luck, really, they end up there. And so they stop the flow. And what Quatermass has realised is what is in these tanks is not synthetic food for humans. It's food for aliens. And inside these tanks are these giant aliens that have invaded the Earth. And they are simply using the humans to feed them gas and protein, to give them an environment in which they can live. If you're a Doctor Who fan, you'll recognise this plot line I'm talking about. It's basically the plot line of the Patrick Troughton story, The Macra Terror, where the Doctor lands on this holiday planet where everyone's having a great time and everyone's really happy to work and add to the community. And what they're all doing is producing gas. But what they don't realise, because they've been indoctrinated and brainwashed, is everything they're doing is just about producing some gas for these giant crabs that live underneath them, that they don't even know about. It's a kind of a Marxist message. All your labour is really for an unknown elite, right? And it comes from this Quatermass II. So at the end, Quatermass reverses the flow. So the monsters have to break out of their towers, and you get these shambling bits of cabbage yomping around the English countryside. It's a blast. And it's a great movie. It's by far and away the least impressive and striking film cinematically of the Quatermass series. I would say it's even less impressive than the ITV remake in the 70s. But in terms of its ideas, I think it's actually the most interesting. It's the best at pinpointing a fear in the population and expanding that fear into a science fiction context. And if you've never seen the film, I really urge you to watch it. And let me know in the comments below what you think of it and whether you got the same impression of it as I did. It's a blast of a movie, apart from Brian DONLEVY. Whatever. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this first edition of Mike's Attic. Next time I'm going to be discussing Saturn III.